So all things are possible. All things are not likely. And what I make as likely or unlikely is just... I have no special knowledge about any of those things. Now, 2012. No, well, of course, all of that is obvious to a certain extent. Of course, media controls masses. Media controls opinion. I mean, that's what advertisers are doing. That's why they spend billions of dollars on advertising. They're trying to control opinion. Certainly, media controls opinion. One of the most obvious opinions they want to control is where you spend your money. What you like, what you dislike. That's the whole point of marketing, is to get you to like something that they want you to like. So sure, there's all of that going on, but now whether it's some nefarious scheme and the strings are all pulled by Mr. Big at the top and so on, I don't see anything that really gets to that. But sure, I see media trying to control, I see governments trying to control, I see husbands trying to control their wives and wives trying to control their husbands and both of them trying to control their children. And we live in a society of control freaks. Everybody wants to control everything in their life. That's just it. And if you have power, then you want to keep that power. So you want to control things to make sure you keep that power. You want to make sure things go the way you want. So I think, yes, most people are trying their best to make sure their life comes out the way they want it and control things. It's, yeah, but that's just the way people are. So you kind of accept that, but there should be no fear or anything. Yeah, I don't get into worrying about any of that detail. That's just, I expect that of people. Okay.
Question over there.
Okay. My question, Tom, is that when we are in the moment and our intention is what it is, and that can affect matter or affect an outcome, I understand that. What is the value of planning or value of setting goals and those things? Is there a negative in that you could be limiting your possibilities or your probabilities by setting those goals, because by then we are affecting that and we're helping to perpetuate that or create that, but could it also work against us to plan?
Yes, of course, anything can be taken to an extreme. Things that are helpful usually become unhelpful if you overdo it. But planning is a good thing to do. You cannot go through life without any planning. You can't just walk through life and, it'll come to me when it comes to me. You tend to walk in circles that way. You need to have some focus and some reason why you're doing things and what you're working toward. Even if it's just very near, what am I going to accomplish this day? Even if it's that near, you do have to have some structure in your life. That's the thing we talked about. You need purpose and you need structure. You need constraints, and that structure gives you constraints. On the other hand, you can overdo that to where you begin to live in order to fulfill, your plans. It's like you have to do it because you planned it. You also need to realize that living in the moment, taking life as it comes, being flexible, plans are good as long as you don't take them too seriously, sort of thing. Yeah, plans are necessary. You have to do that, or it's, how do you pay your mortgage if you don't have a plan? You have to, well, maybe you don't have a mortgage, maybe you live in the park, but planning is fine as long as you don't make it your reason for doing what you do. You do what you do because that's the right thing to do, and if that works you toward a plan, that's good. If it doesn't, it works counter-purpose to your plan, then maybe you need to re-evaluate your plan and be willing to change it.
Hey, Tom. My question to you is about your experience with Kundalini. If you could talk a little bit about that and what exactly Kundalini is.
Okay, my experience with it. I had I think it was probably a whole chapter, a major part of a chapter of book 1 when I wrote the trilogy that had to do with my experience with that. And I had some very negative impressions of it by early readers who didn't think it was too appropriate, so I took it out. But since you asked, I try to answer everything that I get asked straightforwardly. I do have some personal experience with it. When I was about 5 or 6, 7, I had been, and this is in the front part of the book, and if you don't have the book, you can get it on Google. Basically, the first section of the book is a kind of a little history, a little autobiography of my connection with this sort of thing. And I had been having connections with non-physical beings as a young child. It's not that unusual. Many young children do. When you're that young, you're connected very much with the larger reality. And these beings would come and they would interact with me, training, that sort of thing. And after about 6 months or a year or so of being in their training courses, and an odd thing is when you're in that situation, you're not 6 or 7 years old anymore. You're an adult. So when I was out of the body and going through this, I was functioning like an adult. Then I got back into the body and I was a 7-year-old again. Very interesting thing to perceive, but it was odd. That's the way it is. And at the end of that long training period, I did go through a period where this Kundalini, it met the metaphor for Kundalini, you know, how that gets raised and the way the energy comes through the system and so on. So that process was done. And I don't know, I can't tell you that it made a huge difference at that time. It was just shortly after that, then I kind of got sealed out of making a lot of excursions to the larger reality. But I suspect it's more of a graduation present, more of a reward received for having gotten to a certain point, as opposed to this to something that you just get by random. It's a way of modifying the body and consciousness in such a way that the body is a better port for that consciousness to live and work in. So there is such a thing, but then you also have to think, we're talking about metaphors. Things happen and you interpret the data. Now how you interpret the data, I said, was a function of your own experience base. But it's also a function of the data you get. And the larger conscious system can give you data that represents certain metaphors, certain archetypes, just so it'll ring a bell later. Okay, I was discussing, the gentleman asked the first question last night, and he said that a friend of his had a near-death experience, and he experienced the classical Book of the Dead kind of an experience, you know, the river Styx and canoe and the torches and the whole thing, just like you read about. And he said, well, how did he experience that? Because he never read anything about it. Well, the larger system gave him that experience because that was a metaphor that he would certainly run into. And when he did, he could go, aha, that's what that was. That was a near-death experience. I was in the larger system and I was dead for a little bit and revived. And that's what was going on because it's a metaphor he would understand. If it just gave him a brown wall with pink daisies on it, and that's all he saw, then what could he do with that? You say, what interpretation could he give that? He wouldn't have learned anything. Later, he could go, aha, I can put that together. So sometimes the metaphors you get are given to you. They're not just that you make them up from your thing. They're given those certain symbols. So part of that, you go through a Kundalini experience, you're given the classical Kundalini experience interpretation because later you can read about it in a book and go, aha, that's what happened to me. So that's part of why you get that.